Well, Frank, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Parenting podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you here. I love the talking about kind of the way patterns are replicated and like
Mm.
what we can do to interrupt harmful patterns. And sometimes it's funny because like someone was asking me something recently and I said, I think I had just like the right amount of trauma.
I
I was
love that.
like,
I can't wait to hear more about that. That's great.
because like I had stuff to work with, like
Yeah.
I had like a dad with a bad temper and I was spanked
Yeah.
and there was difficulties and things like that, and it
Yes.
made a profound effect on my life, but it wasn't so much that like it
Ah,
was like just the right amount, so
I
it
love
gave me
that.
some fodder to work with and then share this stuff with the world.
I love that. Well, and you know what? The reality is, I think you are probably more the norm,
Yeah.
honestly, because this idea of secure attachment, I don't, we'll talk about this, but I don't think secure attachment exists in total. I don't know anybody with
Oh.
secure attachment. I,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
we will dive right in, but there's ranges. I think we all have all attachment styles, is what I think. I think
That
we
makes
can
more
be,
sense to me.
right? Right?
Yes.
Nobody who has no overwhelming life experience. Nobody I know, none of my friends, right? Like, but we all have versions of avoidant attachment with parts of our parents. We have anxious attachment with other parts of our parents. We have disorganized attachment when our parents give us mixed messages. And we have secure attachment when our parents are kind of resourced and in a loving place. So for me, everybody has all of it. Nobody's one thing, especially in our parent-child
Oh
relationship,
my God, that makes so much more sense to me. Like,
right?
whereas everything is a spectrum, literally everything on
Right.
earth it is a spectrum. And the whole idea of like, the way we've read about attachment, where you're going to fall
Right.
into this one category
Yeah.
or the other,
Yeah.
and it makes this huge, profound difference in your child's life if you don't
Yes.
fall into this one category. And so you're
Yes.
freaking out in those first 3 years, like, you're like, oh my God, they're not going to be securely attached. What am I
Right.
doing? Yeah,
Well,
it's a troubling kind of way we're thinking about it, I guess.
well, and the other side, and here's what I thought, because I knew all this attachment literature when I was raising my kids. I was like, good, I'm gonna do everything I can for the first 3 years and then I'm done. Like done parenting. Like they're secure, I'm good to go, they're good to go. See you later. Like as if that happens too, right? You know what I mean? It's like, oh my God, I've screwed them up. They have a, a mark forever. Or, oh, they're good, no more needing to parent. You know what I mean? The extreme nature of that never made sense to me on either front because it's an
Yeah.
ongoing thing and we all have all of it. I see the ways my kids relate to me differently than they relate to my husband. And I see the way they relate to different aspects of me because we all have different needs at different times and different types of relationship. And I feel it with my parents. Same thing.
Yeah, yeah, and we're always growing and changing and evolving, and so are our
Yes.
kids. Yeah, that whole emphasis on the first 3 years can be put so much pressure on parents and can be
Right.
so, and it's funny because I want to get to your story, but I just have to share, like, thought I had messed up my daughter, which was one of the reasons I dove into learning so much about communication and
Yeah.
mindfulness. And then as years went on, I thought, and she kind of kept repeating these kind of harsh communication styles with her sister and other people. I thought it really stuck when she was young. Maybe I really messed her up. And then, like, just more time was on, and she's 17 now. And I just remember, like, somewhat recently, I came in, I was really upset about, I think it was with the dog, and
Yeah.
her younger sister is normally kind of more emotionally in tuned, and but she was a little upset. And anyway, the older sister, who I had worried about, she said, Mom, do you need a hug? And I said, yes, I do. She's like, Sora, to her sisters, Mom's upset, like, let's take care of her. It was so emotionally in tuned and loving, and I was like, I didn't totally mess her up from those first 3 or 4 years.
We don't have that perspective as we're in the trenches.
No,
Like we
we don't.
don't know the longitudinal trajectory really. It was so like as a trauma specialist, as somebody with a profound trauma history, I was so preoccupied about traumatizing my kids. Like that was the biggest goal for me, is to not transgenerationally traumatize them. And in some degree, my reactivity did have an effect on them for sure. Like there's no doubt about it. And I've taken full responsibility with my kid, especially my oldest, who's kind of in that developmental stage, to talk about it at 20. But he was like, I'm worried and oh my goodness. And he's like, well, yeah, well, and, you had a trauma history. I certainly didn't. I was never traumatized by my parents. And I was like, oh my goodness,
Oh,
yes, like this is his
the,
perspective.
the
He's like, well,
kindest words
I
you could
don't,
ever say.
I don't have that kind of trauma history. I was like, oh my, like, and he was just so matter of fact. Like, it wasn't even an issue for him. It was just a matter
Oh,
of fact kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? And he
yeah.
had no idea, like, all the energy I had put into, doing whatever I could to prevent transgenerational trauma. And nothing's 100%, but I loved his perception of his upbringing
Yeah, you were
compared to
like,
mine.
yes, I did it.
I
Yes.
know. And it didn't feel like that every step of the way, right? Like they change and grow and evolve so much over the years. You
Yeah.
learn that as you go through it.
Well, you share a lot about your story in your memoir, To Be Loved, a story of truth, trauma, and transformation. And that's generally like where I like to start. Some of our
Yeah.
conversations here is about, you know, how were you raised? What was your childhood like? And what's, maybe what's different then about how you're raising your own children. But yeah, what was your childhood like?
Yeah, my childhood was. Do you remember the Wonder Years? I don't know if people are old
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
to
I
remember
remember that.
that
But maybe
sitcom.
the listener doesn't.
I
Sorry.
know, right? Probably they don't. That's why I say that. Right, exactly. So it was this quintessential Midwestern suburb of Chicago, and the houses looked like every house looked the same. Like when we would go into our friends' houses, I knew where everything was because the houses were the same. Like there were these subdivisions, and all the houses were built the same, and it was this like idyllic looking, Midwestern upbringing on the surface, right? And it was, my parents were pretty conservative, as many of the people around us were, growing up in the 60s. And, what ended up happening because of the times is I got caught playing with my cousin's Barbie playhouse in the basement. We were at my cousin's house. I got caught playing with the Barbie playhouse. Frankie, don't you do that. Boys aren't supposed to play with dolls, and I got this like shaming response. And then I was sent to therapy for 6 years weekly to be a
Oh,
normal boy. So
oh,
I grew up in it was like, and my mom will say now in retrospect, we were trying to do what we thought was best, but now I see it was a form of conversion therapy. Like she will say that now. So I grew up like something's wrong with me. I am a problem. I'm defective. I need to be something else in order to be loved. Like that's the title of the memoir, is To Be Loved. And it really was a set of trajectory for me my whole life with a clear message. I'm wrong. There's something wrong with me. And I didn't know what it was. Nobody explained anything to me as a kid. I just had to go to the special meeting. My brother didn't, and I would kind of observe my uncles. I'd observe my brother, who was 2 years younger than me. I had to play baseball. You have to play baseball. You know what I mean? You have to do, you have to shoot the gun. You have to go fishing. Like, so there was this programming, and I use that word to kind of be a certain way in order to be accepted, right?
grooming, kind of,
Total
right?
grooming,
Like,
total
yeah.
grooming. It really was. It really was. And I'm a smart kid, and I was a quick study, so I did all the stuff, and then eventually after 6 years of therapy, it's like Frankie graduated. Like it's successful. He's acting like a boy now. You know what I mean? So I lived a long chunk of my life not being me, not even knowing who I was, because it was really kind of I was so disconnected from who I was, but I was smart. Disconnected but smart, because my smart was achieving love. Like if I get A's, he'll love me, And in the midst of that, there was a lot of physical and verbal abuse in my house. My dad was more physically and verbally abusive, and my mom was passive and accommodating, which is a common dynamic. And so there was physical and verbal violence in the house on top of your wrong. So I spent so much of my life like just really disconnect, like going through the steps and having no self-awareness and self-connection until 32 when I married a woman. I ultimately came out at 32. So
Oh
I've had a
gosh.
long half my life was really uh, being something than I was authentically. So my life really started at 32 when I finally came out as gay and, had a very different life in a way that's authentic, that's connected. I have a husband. We've been together for 25 years. We have two kids, a 16 and a 20-year-old. So it was kind of a tumultuous, to say the least, upbringing. And that's why I became a trauma specialist. Like, no small surprise. Like, it's not only about helping people, which it is, but it was also the journey of, like, who am I? What was this about? How do I heal this? And how do I'm just so happy. I have an amazing life right now, with two incredible kids who have taught me an enormous amount about trauma. Like, forget all my Harvard training. My kids have taught me so much more about trauma healing than any of my training did, I'll tell you that.
Wow, that's an incredible story to just think about
Yeah.
and I'm sure there are so many other people, to be living a life that is not authentically you
Yes.
for
Yeah.
that long,
Yeah.
for that long.
Yep.
And just, yeah. And, obviously you had gone to college, you had
Right.
studied, you had gone through high school, you had gotten married. I mean, that whole
Yeah.
thing. And then what, I mean, was it a series of things that made you realize, how did you
Yeah.
come to realize who you were?
It's a great question. Nobody's asked me that before. It's interesting. So it was, and this is part of what was, the memoir is very raw and it's very open and authentic in a way that sometimes I was like, oh my goodness, am I really going to say this? But the piece of truth and authenticity runs through this memoir. It's like I'm being honest and truthful about what happens from a loving, compassionate way because I've done a lot of healing. But the reason I preface that in that way is that when I was in college, I have a girlfriend who I eventually married, and we're both chemistry majors. We both went to medical school together. But we were on a study break once, and I went into the bathroom at night. We were studying at one of these college buildings, and this guy exposes himself in the bathroom and freaked me out. I had no idea what was going on. I was just totally panicked, but also like intrigued and excited. And it was such a horrible thing. It's like, oh, put it away. I know how to suppress things, so I suppressed it. Put it away, right? And went on and finished medical school, or finished college, got into medical school, and then I was in Boston. My then wife was on call, and I went for a run on the Charles River, and again, another guy exposed himself to me in these cruising areas, gay men looking for sex. And I again freaked out, like it was another blip of like, oh my goodness. And in that point in my life, I was in therapy. So, as a psychiatry resident, they encourage everybody to go into therapy. And so I was in therapy at that time, and there was a lot of processing my own trauma history. So I spent a lot of time working on the physical and verbal abuse. And I realized at that point that I couldn't have access to who I was until I processed my trauma. And I had processed enough trauma that enabled me to start connecting with who I really was. And everybody's different around that. There's no right way to do this, but for me, I needed to process the trauma I was holding first to enough of a degree in order to be able to connect with my authenticity. And so at that point, I was like, this is who I am. My wife and I, my then wife, were in couples therapy. It's like, I'm gay. This is, so it was a big process, but it was like these slow moments, these blips that I then pushed away, these blips that I pushed away, because I knew how to push it. Like I was taught how to push things away. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's what the therapy was when I was a kid. So when I was processed enough of my trauma, my authenticity started showing up more. It was a gradual process over several years. I was in therapy as an adult for 5 times a week for 10 years, like a
Oh,
really
wow.
long time. It was like and I was in Boston, so it's a big psychoanalysis community. So I was in kind of psychoanalysis, and it was helpful. The therapy helped me like release the trauma energy enough to access me, is the way I would say it.
Yeah, you had to talk all that through, get that
Yeah,
all out of being
100,
buried inside your
yes,
system.
100%.
And
Yeah,
yeah, it's so fascinating. Yeah, I think I painted through my trauma.
yes,
I,
that's
I
right.
processed I processed
Yes,
all my trauma through paintings of like
yes, yes.
angry, ferocious beasts.
Yes, 100%. We have all different ways, right? All different
Yeah.
ways. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, oddly, like in some ways, like relate so much to what you're saying about
Right.
like this,
Yeah.
there's all of this inside, and
Right.
you learn the strategies to get by, to survive. You learn
Yes.
the strategies to get
Yes.
through
Yes.
maybe your childhood. Like I remember feeling like, okay, I need to get to 18. I need to get
Yes.
to getting out
Right.
of the house.
Yeah.
And then you get those strategies, and then you're like thrown into life.
Right.
And then life happens, and it's like yeah, to learn who you are, I guess, and to learn how those things affected you. I guess, yeah, this is kind of the work of, maybe what can happen in your 20s. But I mean, I mean, not
Yeah.
everybody was gay and was told that they
Right.
shouldn't be gay, but a lot of us were also dealt
Yeah.
with the trauma of
Yeah.
violent households. Like my I never had bruises on me, but I was
Yeah.
terrified of my father's rage. I remember
100%.
cowering behind the door, and
Yes.
that was pretty normal
Yeah.
for so many parents.
Yes.
And then we get into the parent-child relationship, and we're like, that's 1,000% not what I'm gonna do.
Right.
And then for me anyway,
Yes.
that those patterns start to repeat themselves. And because
Yes.
and tell us about that. Like, I mean, I could kind of see in myself why that was happening. I started
Yeah.
to understand it, but maybe you can tell us
Yes.
why this happens, and maybe if you had some of that experience as well.
100%. 100%. This is the thing. Like, so all the work, all the self-awareness, all the therapy. I'm an expert and I do this for a living, right? So you would think I'd be clean and clear when I
Yeah,
started
yeah.
having kids, right? But no. Right, exactly. And that was shocking for me. It really was because I had done a lot of healing work. I found a very kind, gentle man. It was good. He's like, I need 3 or 4 years before we have kids. Like, I've got to work on myself. And I'm like, great, go ahead. So he worked on himself before we had kids. We started the surrogacy process. So I thought I was good to go. Like, I healed, processed my trauma. I met a lovely man. We were going to get married. It was legal in Massachusetts at the time. And so I was like, this is amazing. I am going to give these children everything I didn't have. Like so many parents. And like you say, it doesn't, you don't have to be gay to relate to I wasn't allowed to be who I authentically am. Like so many kids, so many people grew up with versions of that. Boys, don't be emotional. Girls, don't be tough. And, whatever version, right? We've all grown up with some version of, is it okay to truly be me, right? So I was ready to go with these kids. And and interestingly enough, I always say this, you get the kids you need, not the kids you want. Like both my husband and I so wanted a girl. We had the name picked out. We were like ready for a girl. Like we both had abusive fathers. We're like, we want a girl. And sure enough, we got two boys. And I can see in retrospect now, they really activated stuff in me that was very deep that I was holding on to that got reactivated when I became a parent. And it was mortifying to be reactive, to get angry, to yell at them at times. It was like, oh my goodness, right? And I know this now. I know this as a trauma specialist that everybody who absorbs trauma energy holds victim energy, and we absorb perpetrator energy. It's what happens. It's what happens. So we're not ever just a victim. We also absorb the energy that was bestowed upon us, and we see how effective it is because we're the recipient of it, right? So when my kids started misbehaving and fighting and all this kind of stuff, it terrified the younger part in me who was the recipient of violence. So my perpetrator part came out to stop them from acting that way so it wouldn't make my internal world so scary. And this piece is what parents do with mostly no awareness. This is one of the things I teach over and over again is, there's this parents normalize losing it. And yes, we do lose it. Parenting is very challenging. But for me, I don't want to normalize losing it because every time we lose it, our kids lose their safe parent. Every time we lose it, kids lose their safe parent. And I just had a discussion with my son about this yesterday. It was fascinating. I've done a podcast with him, my oldest now, on transgenerational trauma. When we lose it, it's our job and responsibility to understand what in us got triggered or activated.
Yeah.
And what in us reacted and responded to our kid, which is really about protecting our wounding. It's not about them. They're kids being normal kids. And I think too many books focus on kids' behavior and not enough on parents' behavior.
I couldn't agree more.
Right? We've got to take responsibility for our bad behavior. Yes, it happens, and it is our responsibility to heal the underlying wounds that cause those extreme reactions.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's such a profound statement. Every time we lose it, kids lose their safe parent, and everyone who absorbs trauma energy absorbs victim energy and perpetrator energy. I want to learn
That's right.
more about that, but I think maybe before we go any further, we should stop and define what trauma is, because as a word, it's being used really frequently these days.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we're getting it wrong in a bunch of places. So what is trauma and what isn't trauma?
That's a great question, and it really is variable. That's one of the blessings and the curses, based on temperament and perception. Like you have 3 kids in the same family, kind of with the same behavior, and they all respond very differently. Same parental behavior. And they all respond differently because of their nervous system, because of their sensitivity, because of their temperament. My brother, who's 2 years younger than me, he didn't have the same level of abuse that I did, but he had a different kind of resilience. And he's a big hunter. So he's like, I'm going to dominate and kill animals, right? That was kind of an adaptive response for him in our family. I become this trauma specialist, but I had a sensitivity that my brother didn't in a certain kind of way. So each kid's experience is different, and we have to take that into account when we think about trauma. But I think about intensity, frequency, and duration. The intensity of an event, the frequency it occurs, and the duration. Those are important factors around an overwhelming experience. I think about trauma as an experience that happens to you. It's not who you are, because we personalize our trauma a lot. So it's what happened to you, and how do you react and respond to it? So I want people to differentiate, because a lot of people I am trauma, or this is me, I am broken, I am bad, I'm a horrible person. It's like, no, something bad happened to you, and you personalized it, and then you react and respond this way because of what you're holding.
It's like we
trauma,
digested it in a maladaptive way. Like we had
100%,
digested it in a way where we are seeing it almost from the perpetrator's point of view that
100%.
we are bad
Yeah,
in
that's
order
right.
to survive this
Yeah,
experience. And then that becomes our point of view.
100%. When perpetrators don't take responsibility for their actions, kids do 100% of the time. Kids have to make meaning of a situation. Every time my dad yelled and screamed at me, and he said some pretty violent things frequently, he didn't do the repair apology thing. And so, what am I supposed to think? Well, if I'm a useless piece of shit, I'm a useless piece of shit. That must be who I am. Because kids have this need for parental authority to help them make meaning and sense of the world. And so, when you have that and you don't have, like, this is what happens with alcoholic kids who grow up with alcoholic parents. There's the drunk parent, yelling and screaming, doing whatever. And then there's the sober parent, which is like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And then it happens tomorrow and it happens the next day. So that's not authentic repair. That's the daddy who apologizes and the daddy who yells and screams, which is so confusing for kids, right? That's
And you're
not
talking about the same person.
I'm talking about the same person because that happens in alcoholic situations, yelling and screaming when they lose it or when they're drunk. And then this self-loathing, I'm such a bad parent, I should have never done that, I'm so sorry, when they're sober. That is not what I'm talking about with authentic responsibility and repair. Like, I am wrong, Daddy is wrong, I shouldn't have yelled at you, that is my fault, here's the reason that I did that. Has nothing to do with you. I will do everything in my power never to do that again. If you see me do that, please let me know, because that is not your responsibility. Like, there's a way to take full responsibility for your actions, not like pleading for forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So losing it's important, but almost more important is how you take responsibility for what you've done with your children. And like my oldest son, was so recently, like, after writing this memoir, and he saw all this stuff, he's like, wow, I had no idea all this was happened in your life. I loved my grandpa, like, you know what I mean? He's like, I had a great grandpa. But there was this, he at some point, and was developmentally appropriate, he got really angry at me. He was like 18 years old. And you did this, and you were controlling, and you yelled at me, and you did, well, he like had this text litany of lists of things that he was holding that I did wrong. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you are absolutely right. I am so sorry. Let's talk about it. And he was kind of dumbfounded. Like, he was like, what? Like, you took out all my thunder. And I'm like, yeah, honey, but that's the truth. If you are holding that, then it's true. And your perception and experience of whatever. And there was no defending but I tried the best. And he has a special needs brother. And he's like, you neglected me because you spent all this time on, my brother. I'm like, yes, I am so sorry about that. I am so sorry. I think parents don't take enough responsibility because they try so hard. And they care so much and they love so much, but it's so important for kids to be validated in their experience, regardless of, my parents sent me to therapy when I was a kid, and they were well intended. I know that. They said, we did what we wanted was best for you, but it had a profoundly negative effect on my life. 32 years of suppression. Like, kids have a hard time holding both truths, right? Yeah. So we as parents need to really work on that and model that for our children. And I think that's challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it requires a great amount of, humility, but also not self-flagellation, as you're talking about, like a great amount of compassion for ourselves and 100%. Our humanity, right? That, we're going to make mistakes and we're still okay people, even if we make those mistakes, because we are going to make those mistakes. I really think that self-compassion, really hinges on that. But you mentioned something earlier about this idea of like that when we lose it, that like there's these sort of parts of ourselves. There's this victim part of ourselves and the perpetrator parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And I don't know a lot about it, but I'm feeling this is the
Yeah.
internal family systems. This
Yes.
is the parts that I've heard about and people
That's
talking
right.
to me, but
Yeah.
haven't studied up on. But
Yeah.
maybe you can fill me in and the
Yeah.
listener about this way of looking at our our sense of self and psyche and all that.
Yeah, so the IFS model of therapy, Dick Schwartz is the founder of that model. I'm a lead trainer I teach the trauma training at the IFS Institute. It's this concept that we all have different parts or aspect of our personality. Like parts of us are normal. Like I just got off an email with the folks at Inside Out the folks at Pixar, for example. It's just like Riley in Inside Out. We all have different aspects of our personality. That's what the IFS model believes in. And some of those parts carry pain and wounding, and some of those parts have protective responses. And our protective responses show up to keep our pain at bay. It's a relationship between those parts. And we all have what's called self-energy, our soul, our wisdom, our source, you know what I mean? Our self outside of our parts. And, so there's Riley, and then there's sadness, anger, fear, disgust, ennui, for those of you who have seen the new movie, and anxiety.
Go see it. It's great.
Right? It's a brilliant movie. And, they do such a great job. When I did a project with them that never got funded, but the idea, it's very important for them. They said, we want anything we do with you, Frank, you need to know that every single emotion has a positive intention. And I was like, that is a fundamental belief of internal family systems. Even your bad behavior, in quotes, has a positive intention. And that's important for people to understand. The yelling, the hitting, the screaming towards your kids has a positive intention. Not a positive intention towards your children, the positive intention of keeping your pain away. We yell and scream because our trauma wounds have been activated. That's the responsibility I want parents to take is, we have this saying in IFS, when it's intense, it's yours. And
Yeah.
most people think it's the kid.
Yeah.
It's yours. It's yours.
Yeah.
The intensity
But
is yours.
also, it's so interesting because you're saying like we yell and scream because our trauma wounds have been activated. And I just think about like, one of the things I tell parents all the time is that yelling is not your fault. Like you didn't decide to yell. You didn't wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to scream at Frank at 2 o'clock. You didn't do that. No one does that. No one like is consciously making that decision. And it's
No.
something that's unconscious within us. And it's these wounds have been activated. This is and it's just so helpful to like understand it more deeply and completely that yes, it really, really, really isn't your fault. It's something that's in you that's trying to keep you safe.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's not something you're choosing. You're not
Right.
consciously choosing this.
And you need to move toward it instead of against it. Like get curious about it. Because normally this is the over remorse. Like, I'm such a bad parent. I can't believe what I did. I did like I write about this in my memoir. I became suicidal when when my perpetrator started showing up around my children. I was like, there's nothing worse than to do what was done to you in trauma. So that's when I became suicidal in my life. I'm like, I'd rather kill myself than impose this trauma on my kids. Do you know what I mean? And I felt that in those moments when I really lost it. And, it's that criticism is not what I'm talking about here. I'm like, really like, what is going on here? What did get activated in me? How can I appreciate the positive intention of those responses, even though they've had a negative effect on my kid?
The way I understood it as I was going through this was I would scream at my daughter. I'd feel terrible.
Yes.
I'd hear her crying. I'd be crying, and then I'd say, okay, what's happening? What's happening in this moment? When she gets upset, it feels completely unacceptable in my bones. You
Yes.
know, this is not acceptable.
You
And
know
that
why?
is in be me because of my childhood, right? Like,
When you acted like that, you would have gotten in big trouble.
yeah, yeah,
So it's
exactly.
scary. It's
Yeah,
terrifying when
it's
you're
terrifying.
around that energy. And so you're going to do anything you can. Your part is going to do anything it can to stop her so that your trauma doesn't keep getting.
Oh my gosh. I hope, dear listener, that you're having some insights here. So obviously, we need to heal this trauma, right? We need to
Yes.
make this less
Yes.
scary. We need to be able to be, we want to be able to be steady when our
Yeah.
kids have their big
100%.
feelings so that we can help them emotionally regulate. We
Yeah.
can't be doing that if we're, if we're, we're all,
100%.
losing it ourselves, or we're all upset, and etc. How do we go about the process of
Well,
healing it if all those years of talk therapy didn't
doesn't
heal
work.
it?
That's exactly right. It didn't work. And I'll say a couple things like now, so when we lose it, we're teaching our kids how to not regulate their emotions. That's the other
That's
thing,
true. Yeah, yeah, we're
right?
modeling.
So with my oldest son, and now I am in a very different place, and I've been able to tolerate his anger without reactivity, and I've been able to teach him healthy ways to be angry. And I can see those differences now. But when I was reactive, I was teaching him how to be reactive. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? And and it's because of the healing work that I've done. And there is a way. This is, IFS, internal family systems, is one such model of therapy for healing trauma. EMDR is another model of therapy. There's somatic body-centered therapies, sensory motor psychotherapy, or somatic experiencing. So there's many different types of trauma therapy. So you have to find a type of trauma therapy that works for you to kind of do the internal work. We spend so much time getting away from the pain, and you have to find a model of therapy that allows you to move towards the pain without reliving it. Because when we relive our trauma, it's not helpful. And there is, for me, neuroscience helps us talk about going back, visiting the trauma, not reliving it, witnessing it, listening to the thoughts, the feelings, and the physical sensations that are associated with the part that holds the trauma. The part needs to be witnessed fully. Like me, adult self, needs to get it, fully get it, that what the child part of me experienced. And then there needs to be a corrective experience. That's another important piece, is this part that holds the trauma needs to be loved and cared about in the way that it wasn't. So it needs to share its experience, it needs to have a corrective experience, and that's what enables release to occur. Then it can let go of what it's carrying. So there is a process of healing trauma, and most people don't know about this. There is a process around healing trauma. And so that happens, we don't get triggered as much. You don't, once the wound gets poked, this is what happens when my son gets angry. It's no longer a scary event for me about my history. It's about my son getting angry. And so I have the differentiation. I'm like, look, I know you're really upset. There is a different way to handle this. I'm happy to help you with it. Versus, what are you doing? I can't believe you're doing blah, blah, blah. You're so disrespectful. If blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? So without the reactivity, you can actually be there with kids in a way that they need. There's a new study that just comes out. I've talked about this twice on national TV around a study that just came out within the last week. The way parents think they're providing the support that kids need, and only 20% of kids say they're getting the support they need from their parents. So it's like parents are giving this thing that they think is helpful, and kids are not getting what they're needing and wanting. And it's a brand new study that just came out, and there's this mismatch
You're talking
around.
about like mental, emotional kind of
Yes,
support.
mental and emotional. Yeah, and social needs. That's exactly right. Yeah, and so, you know, because when we lose it, when we're in our trauma, we're clearly not giving a kid what he needs and wants. And I'm not saying parents are in that all the time. I'm saying there's a mismatch. and a lack of responsibility that parents don't take, right? Around this. And it creates a chasm. It creates a big chasm between your kid and your kid and you. And, Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld wrote this book, Hold On to Your Kids. And it's a brilliant book because, and Gabor is a friend of mine. I really love his work. He talks about the attachment relationship that's eroding so profoundly in our culture and society. And this is, part of it is technology, and part of it is parents not taking responsibility for their history, in my view.
And dear listener, you can listen to both Gordon and Gabor talk about Hold On to Your Kids on the Mindful Parenting podcast a few months ago. Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I think what you're talking about, when I think about it from the lens of mindfulness, it's the idea of, in mindful parenting, in raising good humans, I talk about the work of like rain, right? Recognizing, accepting, investigating, nurturing with self-compassion, right? Like doing the brave work of being able to move toward that pain and kind of listen and witness. And that's kind of when I think about what you're describing about what our kids need socially, emotionally from us, as far as that support they need. They need us to be able to listen too, to be able to stay 100%. And listen, not fix a problem, not tell them what to do, whatever it is. They need us to really listen. Right. 100%. To be that support for them.
Much more so than telling them. They need us to listen. And you know what? I have this thing I call the lose it agreement with parents, and that when you lose it with your kids, leave, get away, take the space you need, let the other parent, if it's a co-parenting situation, jump in and bring reality to the situation. Mommy or daddy shouldn't have reacted that way. It was wrong of them to do that, not throwing them under the bus. What was going on for you when they did that? What was it like for you? What were you doing? So to have the non-triggered parent engage with the kid so the kid doesn't lose a parent. And then have the triggered parent come back and repair when they feel compassion for their kid. Because so many parents jump into repair prematurely. I'm sorry I did that, but you shouldn't have hit your sister. I'm sorry, but it's like when you truly feel compassion for your kids, you're no longer in your triggered state.
Yeah, don't rush that. Oh my gosh, Frank, I could talk to you about this for so long. I do have to respect your time. Dr. Frank Anderson's new memoir is To Be Loved, A Story of Truth, Trauma, and Transformation. Is there anything we missed that you want to share with the listener, or where they also can find you and continue the conversation?
Yeah, so the only thing I want to share is I have this everyone deserves to be loved. We all have harmed and been harmed. And I want people, most importantly, to know trauma healing is possible. It's the reason I wrote this book. Trauma healing is possible. You don't have to continue to repeat these patterns even when you're very well-intended, because we all are well-intended. So I want people to know that it's possible. And my website is frankandersonmd.com. All the information is there, all the workshops I do, all the books and courses I do, and Instagram. I'm on all the social media channels, as we have to be nowadays, but Frank_AndersonMD is my Instagram, which is probably the most active social media place I am. And I'm providing as much content as I can for parents and adults and kids alike to get this message of trauma healing out to the world, because I think it's really important.
Well, thank you for doing that work, for being, doing the work that you've done and sharing your story so openly and honestly. I think that it's definitely making ripple effects around the world. And I really, really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you coming on the Mindful Parenting podcast today.
Thank you for having me.